You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Jamie Pavlik of Texas Tech University. Jamie, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks for having me on here. Excited to be a part of it.
So our topic for today is corruption. Jamie has written several papers on the subject, and we'll get into all of them in a minute. So first, Jamie, how about you define what researchers mean when they talk about corruption? I think there's potentially a divide between, the technical definition or the one that researchers work with and what we sometimes mean in ordinary speech when we're talking about, corruption in politics and such. So how about you give the formal definition?
Sure. The formal definition that I think most researchers use is they make sure to define that we're talking about political corruption, and they just really mean the abuse of political power for private gain. Now, this gets confused in, I think, the general knowledge or saying of corruption is a lot of people will infer corruption to mean just corporate corruption, not political. So it does get a little bit confused there. The word corruption can be even misconstrued in research. So some researchers are talking about things like extortion and what I would consider to be non-mutually beneficial exchange. So something like a corrupt official coercing an individual or a firm to engage in bribery or some type of embezzlement. But that's also not universally accepted. So there are some cases where corruption can be mutually beneficial. And in that case, it would be something that's more conducive to development and growth, or just something that benefits private individuals as well as the politician. So there are a lot of nuances in the definition that you have to be careful with when you're talking to the general public and when you're thinking about specific research questions, because then the effect of corruption can be vastly different.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a sense that it has to be sort of under the table. Like, a researcher probably wouldn't count, say, sugar subsidies in the United States as corruption, although they, if we're just talking politics, you might say, oh, that's a really corrupt policy, look at the bad effects it has. But you probably want to distinguish between policies we just don't like that are nonetheless, pass through the standard policy-making process versus something more underhanded.
Right. And part of that issue makes it really difficult to compare corruption across countries, because a lot of it is legality. And if that was a exchange of, dollars, for example, something like lobbying in the United States, in some countries that might be considered illegal and therefore it's considered corruption. So it is definitely dealing with whether it's under the table or more generally just secretive in nature. And that's what one of my papers actually addresses, that issue where if you think about corruption and you think about it being whether it's under the table or kind of just straightforward and obvious, not hidden, it can have less negative effects. So yes, you have to kind of distinguish the legality of it all.
Yeah, so I that leads nicely to the next question I was going to ask. I saw that you have, you have rather a lot of research on this, and you have, some that are zoomed all the way out comparing different countries all across the world in terms of their corruption. But then you have recent papers about corruption in the United States and also a few on corruption in Brazil. So I wanted to ask, there've got to be some big differences between corruption in U.S. and Brazil, or just the developed world broadly and the developing world. Do those present challenges for researching it?
Yes, for sure. A lot of my earlier papers actually focused on the international world, so I would do cross-country analysis. And one of the things I ran into, or problems I ran into there, was the measurement of corruption internationally, because it's just so hard to compare. A lot of the times you'll see indices. So usually you measure corruption across countries using something like a perception index, where you rely on expert opinions of the level of corruption in a country. But a lot of researchers have found that those expert opinions seem to be influenced by other factors, such as the education level of the country and income. And they end up not being related to other measures that are called corruption experience measures. So that makes it difficult to do any analysis across countries in general, and got me interested in starting to kind of analyze some of these indices, which was one of my first papers I ever wrote. But even more broadly, talking about developing versus developed countries, corruption is very different in different countries, in different localities, even within countries. It really depends on a multitude of factors, such as the institutional quality of an area. So you might have corruption in one area because there's, you can say, excessive regulations or just a highly regulated economy. So sometimes corruption can be necessary in those circumstances to start a business, or at least speed up the process of starting a business and induce growth. But in other countries, it might be all extortive corruption and what some researchers call cost increasing corruption. So you really can't even generalize within countries. You have to be very specific as to what the scenario is and all the circumstances when you're analyzing corruption within or across countries. And I found this to be true even within the United States. I actually compared corruption, or the effects of corruption, with product market competition. So the level of competition in a market. For example, how many firms there are, how much they tend to compete. And I found that, the general relationship is that corruption reduces competition. But that's not always true. Even within the United States, you'll see some states with a lot of economic freedom, which is just an overall measure of individual decision-making in place of government decision-making. And you can also interpret it as something like a higher level of economic freedom implies less regulation. If there's less regulation, corruption has a worse effect. If there's a lot of regulation, corruption can actually increase the levels of competition. So you have to be really careful when you're looking at specific countries and specific places in terms of policy analysis, because if you actually find corruption might have a positive effect in some of these cases, reducing it can actually make everyone worse off, and you don't want to do that either.
Yeah. It's important not to just sort of think of one sort of archetypal type of corruption and generalize that to the whole everything we call corruption. So I guess the intuitive explanation for that is if you had, say, very burdensome regulations or barriers to entry for new firms, and then just a little bit of corruption, let's say you're in a country where a business license is very expensive and time consuming and difficult to get, but you need it to operate in the formal sector. And then you pay a bribe and you get your business license more cheaply, more quickly. That's clearly a good thing. At least, it's good that you can now get your business license and start your business and compete in the market. But then I think what you're implying with, if you don't have all that regulation, if you're not using corruption to get around bad policies, if you just have, a smaller set of policies, then maybe you use corruption to attack your competitors or block other firms from entering the market, give special deals to your firm over others, or just informally grant monopoly privilege to one firm in one area.
Right.
So there's a lot of ways that could play out. So you have a recent paper looking at corruption in the United States, and it looks at this issue of using convictions, so people who have been formally prosecuted for corruption as a measure of corruption. Can you talk about the problems with that as a measure, and maybe what are some better measures of corruption?
Sure. So for the United States, well, just to step back a little bit, the motivation behind that paper is we know that corruption can be important, whether it actually increases or decreases growth or entrepreneurial activity is a question we'd like to answer. But to answer these questions, you have to have a measure of corruption. And so in the United States, a lot of researchers rely on corruption convictions, which are mostly pursued in the federal court system. So I think above 90%. I can't remember the exact number right now, but most of corruption cases are held in federal court. And the concern here is, since we're relying on such a formal measure of corruption convictions, there's obviously a lot of corruption that could go undetected, but it also leads to the possibility of something like political influence, and it also relies on the motivations of the prosecutors themselves. So in the federal court, the U.S. attorneys are appointed by the president, and generally they're reappointed each 4-year term, but sometimes they can cross presidencies. That's not that uncommon. But the idea is that they can be removed at any time. So at the discretion of the president. So in 2007, there was kind of an uncommon thing happen. It was President Bush fired several U.S. attorneys. And there's a case, the attorney in New Mexico thought, and he was open about it, that he was fired because he failed to prosecute certain Democrats. And so what that leads to, the idea is that these federal prosecutors can face political pressures to not only prosecute certain political affiliations. So if you have a political affiliation that's kind of the opposing side of the president, of the current president, you might be more inclined to prosecute them. But it also just opens up the possibility that there's influence in general. So there's kind of a common misconception that corruption convictions in the United States are mostly of individuals that are of some sort of political affiliation publicly. So some people think that corruption convictions are mostly of elected officials, for example, but a lot of them aren't. Most of them aren't, actually. So a lot of the political influence in these cases can come from just a general pressure to increase toughness on crime, or the appearance of toughness on crime can be one factor. Another factor, which is a little bit more technical, is that a lot of these studies are focusing on the estimates of corruption convictions across states on different factors like entrepreneurial activity or income. But what they're forgetting is that these states vary in political importance and political factors in general. So California is very different from Texas, and Texas is very different from Pennsylvania, for example. And what that can indicate is that corruption convictions might be different across those states for political reasons. So maybe it benefits a politician more to engage in corruption activity in a politically important state, for example, so one that's important to win for the presidential election. And so ignoring that can cause your results to be a little bit biased in general. So you might not be getting reliable estimates of the effect of corruption on things like growth in entrepreneurial activity. So there's a bunch of different factors going on in that paper. The idea I want to look at is just if corruption convictions vary systematically across states and through time, and if I can't explain these with traditional corruption determinants, then what's explaining it? And the idea is that it might be prosecutor incentives or executive influence. So I do find that corruption convictions are higher in politically important states. So again, states that are important to win in a presidential election, either they have more electoral votes or the actual vote count is pretty close. So they need to campaign more in those states. The president needs to campaign more in those states. And I also find that election years present more corruption convictions and disproportionately more. So the interesting part of that paper is actually this seems to be specific to corruption cases and not specific to any other crime. So corruption cases seem to increase disproportionate to other types of crimes that you wouldn't really expect there to be any political bias in.
Interesting. Yeah, that's an important thing when discussing any sort of crime statistics. I remember hearing about right after Colorado legalized marijuana, the number of people charged with, driving under the influence of marijuana doubled immediately. But the thing is that the number of traffic stops, or the number of times the police checked for marijuana influence more than doubled. So that was an example where the fact that there were more convictions or more recorded incidents of something happening wasn't necessarily a reflection of more of the underlying crime happening, but It was a reflection of more enforcement. And so it sounds like corruption convictions, they're very public. They can sort of signal to the public that, oh, your elected representatives are wasting your money. They're sort of stealing from you. And it sounds like your research has very clearly shown that these are a political tool. They can be used to harm your political opponents. If you control the prosecutors, then you can use that to attempt to influence an election.
Yes, and the one thing you did note that I forgot to mention is that these are very, very publicized crimes. The same day that there is any type of case disposal, so most cases get disposed in a conviction rather than in a dismissal, but there's an article released on the FBI website, the U.S. Department of Justice website, and then the media outlets can pretty easily grab these and talk about what the crimes were and what the conviction was. So they are very publicized. And a lot of them are actually pretty small level officials. There was one case that was interesting in Texas. There's a little bit of a bigger case recently this summer, but most of them are just small local officials doing some type of under the table activity.
Yeah. So you mentioned previously some of your research on the relationship between economic freedom and entrepreneurship and economic growth and corruption in the United States. How did you, in that research and in other research, how did you measure corruption, if not just looking at conviction rates?
Right. So a lot of my research in the U.S. it just has to use conviction rates, but I'm able to actually narrow down the types of crimes that are in my study to make it a little bit more precise. But the better measures of corruption, I think, and if I can ever get a grant or something where I can actually do this, there's one measure of corruption in the United States that was developed in 2003, and it's an experience-based measure through surveys. So these researchers surveyed House reporters in each state to figure out the level or the perception of corruption in politics in those states, with the idea that these reporters are the ones that are most likely to have that knowledge. So that would be one idea. The problem with that measure is that it's only available for 1 year, so it's really hard to develop any relationships between corruption and economic outcomes. My Brazil papers, I think, present one of the most ideal measures of corruption, and I'm not sure how much you can actually replicate these measures, but what they are, so Brazil in 2003 started a random audits program, and what this involved was there is an independent agency that went to a randomly selected number of municipalities in Brazil and audited their books for corrupt activities. And so these were things like there was missing funds, or there was a bridge or some type of infrastructure that was said to be built that wasn't there. And so they'd record irregularities. But what they also did was they consulted the local citizens to see, to get more information on these irregularities and kind of get information on where to look. So what two researchers did from the University of California at Berkeley, so UC Berkeley, they looked at these audit reports and kind of recorded the number of irregularities in proportion to the total number of dollars that these municipalities were kind of in charge of. So the one thing I should mention is the way municipalities get their funds in Brazil. A big portion of it comes from the federal government. So they get a number of transfers that is in proportion to their population. And they're supposed to use these funds to provide public services and infrastructure and things like education. So they have the total number that they were supposed to receive, and then they have a dollar value of kind of resources that were tagged as being corrupt. So something like they said they spent X amount of money to build a bridge and the bridge was never built. So what they do is they look at the share of resources that were found to be corrupt in each municipality and use that as a measure of corruption. What I do is I take that measure and I look at how it relates to things like income, entrepreneurial activity, and actually inequality, which is another area I can talk about in a bit. But
yeah, that's really interesting. And I know we as researchers, we just love it when a policy is applied in sort of a randomized fashion, because then we know that this is not going to be endogenously correlated with the things we're trying to study. But it's often very hard to convince governments to do things randomly because they have other priorities, and they maybe want to send the resources where they feel they're most needed. But if they can just do randomized control trials and randomize things like this, these corruption audits, then researchers can bring back information about policies that work and don't work, and potentially have a lot of long-term benefit. One thing that really interests me in your work on Brazil is you talk a lot about the relationship between corruption and the informal sector. So tell me, why should we think that those are related?
Yeah, so there's actually a pretty big literature on the relationship between corruption and informality. And so informal work there, I just mean you're working, it's not necessarily under the table in Brazil because it's a pretty common thing, but you're working without what they call a formal labor contract. So you don't have certain benefits of formal labor. And the idea of those two things being related, so some researchers think that they're related because corruption is used to stay hidden. So if you're an informal firm and you get big enough in size, you might have to use bribes to kind of have the government just ignore that you're operating under the table and not paying taxes. But you also might have them being related in kind of a substitutable fashion. So you might have there being a lot of corruption in the formal sector, which is actually the case in Brazil. Most corruption takes place to operate formally or to be awarded a certain government contract. There's some pretty crazy examples that are in those audit reports I was just talking about of corrupt activities in the formal sector. But you might use corruption operate in the formal sector, and what that kind of does is those individuals that don't have the proper political connections, they tend to hide underground. So they're not necessarily using corruption to go underground, but you might see corruption in the formal sector driving individuals that don't want to engage in that activity, or maybe it's too costly to engage in corrupt activities, so they go underground. And this is pretty important for some economies, especially Brazil, because just like corruption, there are some policymakers and researchers even that believe the informal, or sometimes it's referred to as the shadow economy, should be completely eliminated. It tends to be less productive than the formal economy, and some even view it as a, quote, parasitic factor on the economy. So it actually reduces income and the productivity of that specific area. But the problem with this is if we have corruption driving informality, if the individuals are actually trying to escape a corrupt formal environment so they can be more productive, or relatively more productive in the informal sector, if we get rid of it, then we are again hurting individuals without fixing the problem. This relates to a paper that Sean Mulholland and I are working on right now. We're almost ready to post a working version of it, but the effect of corruption, again, on income inequality, which isn't exactly a new topic. And we find that corruption increases income inequality with the basic idea that those that are already well off are the ones that are more likely to have a political connection, and the ones that are more likely to use corruption as some type of advantage, further increasing their income and increasing the income gaps. But what we also find is that areas in Brazil that have a larger informal presence are less affected by this. So if you have a lot of corruption in an area where you also have a large informal sector, individuals can just escape the formal sector corruption and go underground. So again, it's kind of one of those important factors where you can't just get rid of one thing without understanding its underlying causes.
So let me see if I understand this. So the officials are in some sense the gatekeepers to the formal sector of the economy. And being in the formal sector has certain benefits. There's the famous De Soto hypothesis about, the formal sector confers formal property rights, and that allows you to, for instance, if you're take out a loan or secure capital. I think that has fallen out of favor a little, but in some general ways seems to be true in some sense. And these officials, if they're the gatekeepers to access to the formal sector, can sort of try to capture the rent that firms or individuals get from being able to enter this sector. And if they're very corrupt, if that rent that they try to capture is, or if the entry fees essentially they charge, the bribes they require are too high, then people just don't enter the formal sector and they operate in the informal sector. And that, I think what you're saying is that takes away the power of these officials. It makes them less damaging, less able to affect outcomes and inequality and such, because with less formal sector they have less power. Right. Is that more or less correct?
Yes, yeah, that's pretty much the idea. And again, this is something that is dependent on a country-specific basis. So in Brazil, that's definitely what we argue to be the case. We argue that because the informal sector is a plausible option, it can act as kind of a constraint on these corrupt officials and reduce their negative effects on the economy. But there are other cases where there are relationships between informality and corruption that can work a little bit different. And Dreyer and Schneider have a really good paper that kind of analyzes the corruption informality relationship. In their paper they call informality the shadow economy. But they argue that the relationship between these two factors, whether informal sectors work as a kind of restraint or not, depend on just the development of a country. So a country like the United States might have a little bit of a different relationship, because if you get bribed in the United States, you have a little bit better of a court system, and you can usually just take the corrupt official to court. Rather, in a country like Brazil, that might not be as much of an option. So your alternative might have to be go work informally. But the De Soto hypothesis is really interesting. And I think I already mentioned the parasitic phrase or quote. So the same paper, it's a Schleifer paper. He talks about the romantic view, which he calls De Soto's view of the informal economy, versus something like a parasitic view, where the informal economy is kind of a drag on economic growth. It brings it down. One thing I want to do is kind of tease out De Soto's romantic view a little bit more in Brazil, where I look at actual institutional quality to see if informality actually helps when institutions or formal institutions are fairly poor. So that'll be kind of a future research project. But
right. So De Soto is sort of viewing the informal economy as, they're throwing off the shackles of a corrupt system.
Right.
But in some sense, I guess what Schleifer is saying is that formal businesses or businesses in the formal sector, maybe they provide some sort of public goods, a consistent framework, and they contribute to things in a way that is beneficial for all.
Yes.
And, I think in the most ideal case where regulation, is well considered and, targets actual potential market failures and, promotes efficiency, then that would seem to be the case. And so it seems like these aren't totally, they're not totally opposed, because it really depends on the type of regulation and the type of institutions.
Yeah, and that's kind of the goal of the paper, is to just kind of connect the two ideas a little bit better with institutions, because I think they are talking about the same things. It's just, again, a case-by-case basis as to whether the informal economy is a good thing or a bad thing.
So you have some of your research on corruption targets the specific idea of spillovers. If you just look at, this is sort of technical, but if you just look at a regression and you look at the relationship between things you're interested in, corruption and inequality and economic growth and size of the informal sector, you might get some bias because there are spillover effects between neighboring areas, in this case in Brazil, but all over the world. If there's an economic shock that happens in Alberta, I live in British Columbia, right next to it, and it potentially affects me.
Right.
So, talk about how did you go about tackling that issue when you're studying this?
Yeah, so the basic idea I did this with corruption, and I did it in a few other papers that are just on institutions in general, but the idea is your neighbors. So in the Brazil case, your neighboring municipalities, those are the individuals you're more likely to trade and exchange with. Your economies tend to be linked. And what that means is if one economy has this type of behavior where corruption is a norm, and that just tends to be how you interact and make business transactions, the neighboring economy is more likely to pick up that type of behavior. And the same can be said with income. So if one economy is doing well, there might be positive spillovers on the neighboring economy because you are a trading partner. And same thing with negative shocks, as you mentioned. If something bad happens in one area, then it might also affect your area. So if income goes down and you can't produce as much, maybe you can't trade as much anymore. But for corruption specifically, it seems to be really important about interaction. So if you're interacting with corrupt individuals or individuals that just think that corruption is a normal activity and not necessarily something that's immoral or whatever, then your neighbors are going to kind of learn that behavior as well. And so maybe they realize that it increases, if there's bad institutions or excessive regulations, maybe they realize that increases their productivity or something like that. But the idea of all these papers is you can't get a proper estimate on the effect of your increased corruption or increased economic freedom or whatever you're looking at, whatever type of institutional factor you're looking at, whether it be political corruption or the economic environment. That is going to affect your own income, but it's also going to affect your neighbors as well. And the reason being, again, you're interacting with these individuals and you're kind of showing them your behavior exchange. It's going to affect their income as well because they might pick up on those corrupt behaviors, and maybe that'll also have a negative effect on their income. Now, what's really important in the corruption sense, but I would say kind of more important with spillovers, is just looking at economic freedom. So there's this classic argument that increasing economic freedom in an area, if you're looking at a localized level, is a zero-sum game. And the reason people argue this is they think if you increase economic freedom, and which would correspond to decreasing regulations or taxes, so if you increase economic freedom in one metro area, all that's going to do is it's going to steal businesses away from less free economic areas. And so one important thing of our research is we find that that's actually not true. We actually find that increasing productivity and through economic freedom in one area has positive spillovers. So the idea that there's a zero-sum game is kind of eliminated, or we kind of show it's not true because a lot of those individuals are forgetting about the income factor. So if income's increasing in one area, that tends to have positive effects in all surrounding areas, even if some businesses are in fact moving, because we do see that happen in the United States, especially at the state level. A lot of businesses are moving to Texas, for example, because of tax rates and things of that nature. But the whole idea you have to think about is who are your trading partners and what behaviors are kind of going from one area to another, and how does that affect other areas' income as well. So you can't view each economy as a separate entity. They're all related.
Yeah, there's an intuitive sense that, if you're starting a business, you might want to headquarter in the place that's going to lower your taxes. So, for instance, there's a huge number of a lot of, if you see those international cargo ships, bringing goods to different places in the world, disproportionate number of them are registered out of Panama. Not because Panama is some kind of economic giant, but because it's just, slightly cheaper if you do it that way. They just have a very permissive legal environment for, registering your international vessels. But what you're showing is that if these regulations, if they're actually harmful, it's not zero sum. Panama might, or Texas might pull businesses away from California, but there's still growth overall, and there's still a benefit to California when Texas becomes more economically free, even though they lose potentially firms to Texas. There's still some spillover, some gain.
Yeah, so it can go through two mechanisms. So first, if you're California and you're seeing that, well, California is not a good example because sometimes they don't change their policies, but in most cases, on average, if you do see your neighbor making some type of policy change, that maybe they lower tax rates or do some type of, maybe they relax regulations or some sort of policy that makes it a little bit less costly to do business, you might see some businesses relocating. But what that does is that'll increase their profits and their income. And you have to remember, income isn't kind of just spent on your own locality. There will be income spent on surrounding areas, which can have positive effects on all surrounding areas and all neighbors, even if you did lose that business. The other part of the hypothesis and idea that you have to remember is if economic freedom increases in one area, the politicians that are losing businesses are going to see that, and they will also change their policy. And this is kind of related to the idea of yardstick competition, where policies tend to be the same in clusters. So the idea that if voters see, oh, our businesses are being lost because they have lower taxes in our neighboring municipality, metro area, whatever unit you want to talk about, they're more incentivized to get their politicians to also implement those policies. So you might not see as much business movement as you otherwise would have. And what that will also do is then increase income in both areas, and it'll have reinforcing effects in that case. So there's some missing stories that aren't being told in the zero-sum game. It's not just like you're going to lose a business and no other businesses are going to replace it. What might happen instead is you might lose a business and then you also change your policy, because there are different spillover effects in that aspect as well, which can replace the whatever negative gains you might have had and increase productivity in both areas.
Yeah, I think a sort of unstated premise here is that a lot of regulations are too burdensome, too costly, impose barriers to entry, raise costs, and seeing different municipalities or different political jurisdictions compete down their level of taxation and regulation is a good thing. And in general, that might be true, but if you're looking at it from another sense, where maybe there's some regulation designed to address a genuinely bad negative externality, then that might get competed away as well. So there's two sides to this, and depending on where what your priors are about quality of regulation, quality of policy, and the value of those policies, this could look good or bad depending on where you're coming from.
Right, and I'm not really talking about any environmental regulations or anything like that. That's kind of a separate issue. I'm just talking about income per capita. In general, just average income, which is obviously an aggregate measure, and you might be missing some of the more nuances, like if there's a specific regulation that protects the environment or something of that nature where there is a negative externality. That's an entirely different concern. And again, as much of my research points out, none of this should be said as kind of a just blanket statement. There's always special cases for everywhere you look at. You have to be very careful in the analysis of whatever unit you're talking about or area you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. So one thing you sort of touched on indirectly when you were talking about the spillover effects of corruption and how it can sort of culturally spread from one region to another. I think we should discuss the cultural factors in corruption. There's some researchers here at Simon Fraser, some experimental economists who are doing corruption experiments. So basically a trust game with a third party who is hurt if you cooperate with the other player in the game. And what they're doing is they're comparing, people in Canada to people in Iran and comparing not just the level of corruption, but whether they are more corrupt when they're playing the game with someone with some kind of like kinship tie, or and the hypothesis is that a society like Iran, it's this sort of society with really strong kinship ties, and you interact with and deal with your own family and people in your own sort of tribe before, and you favor them over outsiders. And so the hypothesis is that societies that have this sort of culture are likely to have more corruption in terms of conferring special benefits, especially to people in your extended family. So what can you say about culture and corruption? I think that's, there's potentially a lot of connection there.
Yeah, it's a highly debated topic, and I think experimental economics will be very, very helpful in this concern, because it's really hard to look at this and test it anyway empirically with just normal data. It's hard to say, and it's very controversial to say that some societies are just inherently more corrupt than others. I think it's a longer process than that, and again, it's more of the result of institutional factors that just drive something to be a part of your culture. So maybe you're from an area that's just been, you just are used to kind of corrupt officials, and it's just your way of life. It's not anything you really think about too much. You just view it kind of as an extra cost. And there's those circumstances, but there is also the argument, like you were mentioning in Iran, where it might be something a little bit more, I don't know, inherited, I guess.
Yeah, and for the record, these are Iranian graduate students who are doing this research. So we're not just sort of pointing the finger at Iran and saying like, oh, your culture is bad. It's sort of people investigating their own culture and trying to find the problems in it. But it's potentially a problem for a lot of what they call segmentary lineage societies I recently learned about, but that's a topic for another episode. Go on with what you were saying.
Yes, and that's generally how it is. I have a friend, he is from Mexico, and one of his research questions and something he's interested in, just because he's experienced it himself, is that when you're in Mexico, he's the same person, but he understands the institutional environment and that it's normal to expect to pay a bribe if you get pulled over for a police ticket, for example. But when he lives in the United States, he knows that that's not culturally appropriate. So it's not necessarily that the individuals themselves are more corrupt or not corrupt. It's kind of the institutional context. And that's true for formal institutions as well as informal institutions of trust and just understanding your environment. But there is also the case where some individuals don't change their behavior when they get into certain circumstances. So the classic paper of the parking tickets of diplomats. Diplomats from more corrupt societies seem to get more unpaid parking violations in the United States. So sometimes you don't have this transfer. So it's an interesting question. It's one that hasn't been answered, and I think is an area of future research for sure. I just recently read a book where the whole premise of the book was talking about how you reduce corruption effectively. And she argues that the only way you can do that is if it's a long process. You have to get the norms to change first. So you can't just go in and say no more corruption and you implement some type of punishment. You have to understand if it's like the norm or if it's an exception. So in the United States, corruption would be probably an exception. In a country like Mexico or Brazil, corruption would more or less be a norm. So there's a lot that goes into it. And I think there's a lot of areas of research that can benefit this topic.
Yeah. So in terms of this norm, one thing, we've been comparing the U.S. to Brazil a lot because you've done research in both of them. But another one of your papers showed that going from the least corrupt societies, a place like Sweden that has, almost no corruption, where it's extremely rare, to a society with not very much corruption, but still a little bit, like the United States, can have a potentially large impact on economic growth. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So I think what you're talking about, my corruption and uncertainty paper, the idea behind these factors and the effects of corruption and whether it's a norm or not, it all comes down to uncertainty. So if you're in an environment where you kind of expect to, you know what's coming. So if you're in an environment where you have to, maybe if you're shipping something and you have to go through a port, you know what the port tax is, and then you already expect there to be a percentage tax that goes to the official. So you kind of incorporate that into your normal costs. It doesn't have much of an effect because it's just another operating cost, for example. But if you're in a country where you either don't experience that much corruption or you experience it, but it's not predictable, so you don't know if they're going to charge you 50% tax one day or 150 one day, percent of whatever the tax is, then it has a little bit more of an effect because you can't properly forecast what your costs are going to be and how much you should produce. And what that does is it makes things like, first it increases the cost of existing entrepreneurs, but it also reduces potential investors because they don't know, they can't predict what their profits will be if they would invest, or what their return to investment would be because it's just not clear. So again, it's a case-by-case basis. You can have the same level of corruption across two different countries. So maybe you have two highly corrupt countries, but their effects on growth and income are going to be drastically different depending on the context of the corruption. So can you predict what's coming? Can you predict if you're going to be required to pay a bribe and how much that bribe would be versus is it just unpredictable? And you can't really plan for these corrupt activities in your production set.
Right. So there's a risk premium on any sort of business activity in a corrupt society, and that in general might be enough to prevent some of the marginal firms or the marginal business ventures or activities to not happen.
Right.
Do you have any closing thoughts? Anything about this topic that you think people should know about that maybe we missed?
The most important part of this topic, I think, and honestly the reason I started researching corruption, is really just to emphasize that individuals need to look at the actual circumstances. If your goal is to induce development or to induce economic growth and help the least well-off individuals, you can't just make blanket policy changes. And a lot of the international organizations like the World Bank, the United Nations, OECD, they have anti-corruption initiatives. But what you'll find in these programs is just blanket statements about reducing corruption. And they'll have agreements with specific countries, like Brazil had an agreement where they have to reduce corruption by a certain amount, so they'll set goals. But the problem with this is corruption might not actually be the problem. It might be the symptom of more underlying concerns, and addressing corruption might actually reduce welfare. Now, what I want to emphasize in saying that is I'm not saying corruption's a good thing and we should encourage corruption. If you encourage corruption as your solution, you can get very bad outcomes and what's called a vicious cycle, where we have a lot of regulations, so let's just use corruption to get around it instead of fixing the regulations. What you might have are officials realizing they can extract dollars out of individuals to get around regulation, so they might put up more because they can extract more. So I'm not saying that we should encourage corruption either. I'm saying we need to kind of sit down at a case-by-case basis. And even within countries, as I mentioned throughout the podcast, or throughout our discussion, it's not constant within countries either. So Brazil has vastly different cases across municipalities. There are over 5,000 municipalities in Brazil, so there's a lot of different cases. You have to sit down and think about what's causing corruption, why corruption's there, and that way you can more effectively address it.
My guest today has been Jamie Pavlik. Jamie, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Economics Detective Radio. If you're listening in your browser or on YouTube, I recently posted all the episodes to YouTube and they'll be rolling out over the next several weeks. Then I encourage you to subscribe to the show. Now, if you have an iPhone, you can subscribe in your podcast app that comes automatically installed. If you're on Android, you have to download one. Just type podcasts into the Play Store. There's one called Player FM that's free and good. And search Economics Detective or Economics Detective Radio in your app. Hit subscribe. Couldn't be simpler, and that's the best way to consume the show. It'll automatically download when you're on Wi-Fi if you want it to. It'll tell you whenever there's a new episode, and you can consume it, when you're on your commute or when you're doing dishes. That's when I listen to podcasts. Please subscribe. That's the best way to consume the show. And if you enjoyed this episode, I'm sure you'll enjoy other episodes of this show. If you really like the show, if you've been listening for a while, please join the Facebook group. It's called Economics Detective. You can search it on Facebook. You can request to join, and that's where I'll be having discussions of episodes and keep people updated about future guests and where I am in production, and we can discuss economics and politics and philosophy and whatever else you want. I'm trying to build a community around the show, and if you want to be part of that community, go join that group. Thanks, and I'll be back next week.